Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together.
Hey, friends. Hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And as I say every week, this is a very special episode because this episode is with none other than Tiavalya Befecadu. She is a quilter and a photographer, and you can see how both of these practices are mutually sustaining art forms for Tiavalya. I had the great pleasure of meeting Tiavalya in person in 2023 when she came to the So Black Affinity space that Black Women Stitch hosted at QuiltCon. And when I tell you she is a ray of sunshine in real life, just as she is lighting up your screen right now. And if you are a Patreon supporter, you get to see her and this gorgeous quilt that is apparently a work in progress. I think it's like a work in perfection, but she's calling it a work in progress that she still has to quilt. But it is a beautiful quilt behind her lovely piecing, gorgeous piece applique that seems very much in line with her style overall. So Tiavalya Befecadu, welcome to the Stitch Please podcast, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's so great to be here. I'm so honored.
I am honored that you agreed. You can see Tiavalya's work on her website. You can find it on Instagram. She is very generous, even with some of the behind the scenes things about like how she puts things together, how she goes from photograph to sketch to quilt to ideation to execution. It's just so wonderful. Tiavalya, can you tell us a bit about your sewing story? How did you get started with stitching?
Well, my very first memory is I took home economics in the eighth grade, right? And, it was a required class. I made a pillow. It's very pristine. I still have it. It's in plastic. I made it in eighth grade. And then I didn't sew again until really, I was maybe about 24, 25, and I was a Girl Scout troop leader, and I needed to know how to sew those badges on for the girls. And
Oh,
so my friend of mine, her mother taught home economics. So she showed me kind of how to use a sewing machine. Did that for a while, put it down. In 20, let me see, let me see, how old is my child? In
I know.
2010, right? In 2010, I took a sewing class at Joann's, right? And so I was
Hmm.
like, I just want to sew. My grandmother was a sewist. My mother sewed. I said, I'm just going to take a sewing basic 101 class. And I
Hmm.
took it and I was like hooked. And I was like, okay. Next step was taking a quilting class. And I convinced my mother to take it with me. I took that in 2010. And I was so slow. I had no experience, from 10 years ago. And I just was in there, didn't know what I was doing. My mother made me cut all the fabric. So she just like, so she could just sit down, right? And sew.
It's
And
like, I
I
have an
just,
idea of
I don't
something
know.
you can do. I know what you can do, Tiavalya. Let me help you, girl. Let me help you. Why don't you go cut out these 90 yards of fabric real quick for me? Do that for mama real quick, and I'll meet you back here.
Yes, like all of her triangles and squares. I did. And we used my grandmother's old singer from the 70s. And so my mother made a king size quilt. It was a twin size quilt class. She's like, well, I'm gonna make a king because what am I gonna do with a twin size quilt? I'm gonna make something for my bed. I didn't finish mine, right? And I put it away. And then the pandemic hit, and that's kind of where everything kind of, restarted for me.
So in 2010, you're like working on this, you take a class at Joann's, you start a quilt, your mother finishes twice the quilt that you were able to get started on. And then you were like, you know what? I think I'm pretty good with sewing these Girl Scout badges on. Girl Scout, you know what? How much more does a person need to sew? Honestly, the Girl Scout badges are great. This quilt is wonderful, and I will return to it at another time. And then another time became 2020.
Yes, it sat there for 10 years. It was not bound.
I love it. So 2020 hits and you are at home with the kids and it is pandemic time And did things slow down for you a lot in 2020? Were there things that you were planning to do but you couldn't do because of the pandemic? Share more about how the pandemic kind of activated some of your creativity.
Right. So I have a photography business and, I wasn't taking any photographs. Right. And so I had to find something creative to do. My kids were at home. We're doing virtual school. My husband was working from home. It's just, it was too much. And so I had to figure out something. And so I really give God all the credit because he put the idea in my head. He said, we're going to find a way to take photographs and turn them into a quilt. Like, I honestly, it just kind of came out of nowhere. That's why I have to credit God because I don't know. I just said, I have to find something to do. And everyone was doing something, I feel, crafty over the pandemic. People bought sewing machines and knitting and crocheting, and we had to do something to break our mind away from, like, police violence on TV and George
Yes.
Floyd, being murdered, and all these
Yes.
things, right? And so I just said, I've got to figure out a way to do this. And that's kind of how it all started.
That is wonderful. And what was the first piece that you recall making from 2020? Do you remember one of the first quilts that you did that gave you the breakthrough feeling that was like, "You know what? This is something I wanna stick with."
So let me go back and say during 2020, we cleaned out the shed at my grandparents' house because we just had just lots of time. And we found bags of old clothes and unfinished quilt tops that were my grandmother's, and they were sitting in this shed, that's not very secure,
Yeah,
not air
not
conditioned.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I said, okay, this is a sign, right? This is a sign that I have to do something. And so I decided to take that bag of clothes and old quilt tops, and I said, I'm going to make a quilt out of this. And I'm going to take photographs of my mother, my daughter, and I, and dress us in the fabrics of my grandmother. And I'm going to connect the generation. And so I said, I'm going to make it for my mother. And that's how it started. And so, I started off with one block of my daughter. She's like in her little ballerina outfit, her dance photo, and I took like an old dress of my grandmother's. I just took it apart, and I mean, it was really, it's really kind of fantastic, but I like bootlegged it real good. And I
Yeah,
made a
yeah.
quilt block and I posted it in a Facebook group, and people said, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to give yourself some more seam allowance at the top because the block, was maybe about 8 inches, and it was
Okay.
just really tight all the way to the edges, right? And
Yes.
so I said, okay, I'm going to redo it. And I did a zigzag stitch and I used like white thread. And, like I didn't try to match anything, any skin tone or match to her clothes. And so that's where I started. I started and I made something for my mother. And I just took all these pictures. And my grandmother just had, this is like polyester and, you know, oh, like kind of like canvas, kind of, thick woven cotton material
Yes.
and denim and all that kind of stuff, like my grandfather's coveralls and corduroy, all these things. And so each picture, I just dressed us in her clothes. And it was like stuff that my mom would remember because my mom would say, oh, I bought that for your grandmother when I got my first job. And it's like a bright orange polyester 3-piece suit, right? And
Oh
so
my
I put that
gosh.
together and I took it, to my mother. We were social distancing, and I took it to her porch, and she came out and she said, what is this? She's like, do you think I'm about to die? Like, what is this super sentimental gift? And so I just, I just was like, I just really want to make this for you. And, I think with COVID, we just were all so sensitive. We just didn't know, who was coming and going. And so I made this for my mother, and that I posted that picture of this quilt, on Facebook. I'm like, look what I made, y'all. Like, isn't this cute? And people said, oh, I want one. Oh, what's that? I want one. And I said, well, I might be on to something.
Listen, listen. I love how you made your mother this amazing tribute that you went through your actual family archive and you found fabrics that came from garments that were worn by your
Mhm.
grandmother, by your mother, and maybe even by yourself from like a long time ago. And you
Mhm.
resurrected those fabrics. You took them out of the oblivion of a storage shed that was not climate controlled,
No.
where all of that stuff was exposed to all manner of elements, and only the polyester could survive that. I mean, considering how polyester is
Considering,
designed,
right?
you know, that's
Right.
the polyester is
Right.
a durable material. And so you were able to actually pull all that together and reactivate powerful memories. And instead of your mama
Mhm.
being like, "Oh my gosh, this is wonderful. I love it." I'm sure she was feeling that too, but she was like, "Wait a minute. I ain't checking out yet. You don't got to give me no final gift. I'm not ready for that." But the fact that that is what it weighed to her, you know what I mean? That
Mhm.
it seemed
Mhm.
like a huge culmination of love that you were
Yeah, it
presenting her
was.
with and how she was very affected by that. And I think that's a wonderful story to kind of encourage your creativity overall. And so did this was this one of the first things when you started to post you posted this image on Facebook and folks started to ask you like, "Hey, I want one too." Did you start taking commissions right away or did you continue to refine the technique or did you do both?
A bit of both. I felt pretty confident in my skills, based on YouTube University. I used to check out a lot of books from my local library at that time, but I felt pretty good. I practiced some, but that quilt, I think it had 12 images. So it took me a while to really, get my technique together. But I felt pretty good about it. And I took a commission. Like a lady asked me to make two quilts for her back to
Okay.
back
Mhm.
right away. And so I just said, okay.
Now,
I
at
just
that
did it.
point, had you started working with a long arm in terms of the quilting you were doing? What kind of things were you doing to quilt your pieces? Were you still using single needle machine? How did you evolve into what you do right now, which is to put a quilt on a long arm sewing machine?
Right. I did start on my domestic machine, shoving it through that throat space. And I think what happened was about by the end of the year, and so I started in the summer, and by the end of the year, I didn't like basting on the floor. I didn't like getting down the floor. I didn't like curved needles. I tried to spray base. It
Yeah.
didn't work. And so my husband, who's awesome, he's one of those people that he encourages me to say, if you can find something that makes you work faster and it's more technologically advanced,
Yes.
go for it. So I bought a long arm sight unseen, really. Like I had only watched some YouTube videos.
Wow.
I went to a quilt shop and they were like not really giving me the customer service,
Mm-mm.
that I really wanted. Cause they're expensive. It's a really big purchase. So, and then they didn't give me a good price. So I went online and I found someone in Florida who gave me a good price on long arm. And then I just purchased it. I mean, I just bit the bullet and it's been a saving grace for me because I do a lot of large, quilts. And
Yes.
also it just is an easier process for me and it's not backbreaking to say the least. Yeah.
Exact No, I love that, and I appreciate you sharing that story about going to a local dealer and not being treated with the courtesy and respect that somebody who is buying an expensive machine deserves, and I just wanna break it down for y'all, like, even the domestic machines, when you buy them from a sewing machine dealers, they can be expensive. I'm gonna put some context on the word expensive because what I think is expensive might not be what somebody else thinks is expensive. But my serger that I bought at a most recent show, I got a discount, a show deal, and it was like more than $6,000. The domestic machine that I have here was retailing for closer to $8,000, and I might have gotten it for maybe 5,500. So like we're not talking a $200 purchase. And when you get up into the long arms, I have not seen a long arm that's less than five figures. I think that the long arms, this is a $10,000 minimum investment. And so it's kind of like, the same retail experiences that Black people have everywhere. We have them in quilt shops. There's a whole huge knitting community created by Black women because of how poorly Black women are treated in knitting shops. So the same type of like racism or anti-Blackness that we face everywhere also crops up in the things that we love. And that can be so painful. And so I'm really glad that you were able to find an alternative because I
Mhm.
think there's nothing worse than having to convince some shop how to treat you well.
The other thing about the long arms is these quilt shops, they, different dealers at different places, and they kind of like judge you, when you come in. They say, well, is she going to afford this? And, if you're going to buy any machine, I want a demonstration. I want you to
Yes.
show me, like, I want to practice. I want to, and then I might want to go home and think about it too, right?
Yes.
And so if you're not going to give me hands-on experience, hands-on demonstration, then why am I there, right? And the price was $800 more at my local shop than the Florida shop where I purchased it from.
I mean,
So it's like, what are you doing? Is that my price?
yeah. And I do think that dealers do have some wiggle room with what different incentives they can give, different like promos they can give, and all of that because it's so personal. That's one of the reasons why you can't check any of the prices for this machines online. It's very difficult to say, let me look up how much a baby lock blah 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 or a Bernina blah 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 or a Grace blah 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 would cost or a handy quilter this or that. All of those
Mhm.
prices, you're not going to find those just out in the world. Each
Right.
dealer gets to set their own kind of within some limits. And I just feel like long arming is such an expensive enterprise. It's not just expensive to buy the machine, it's also expensive to equip it. So getting the needles, the batting, the maintenance, it's a real commitment. That's why I think it's so useful and important to have a good relationship with a dealer.
Mhm.
It's just it
Mhm.
can be hard to come by because too many of these little businesses are, just don't treat black people well. And that's unfortunate for them because I will spend my money elsewhere.
That part.
I'm so excited. So you got your long arm and you're finally like you're really approaching these quilts. I would love to talk through some of these gorgeous pieces that you have created. So let's
Okay.
begin with this gorgeous Maki Dada from the color purple. This is so beautiful. Can you walk us
Thank
through what's
you.
happening here? What was the motivation for the use of color? What do you see this communicating? Even for folks who aren't familiar with the book or the film, talk us through this gorgeous quilt.
So this quilt, I work a lot on commissions, but this is a quilt. This is a quilt that I wanted to make, for not necessarily for me, but for my own creativity. It wasn't someone else's idea to make this quilt. And The Color Purple is one of my favorite movies. And that hand clap game is everything. If a black woman sees another black woman and we're playing the
Exactly.
predicate, right? Like they know that reference. And so this quilt, it started because I bought a book, borrowed a book from the library about hexagons and what you could do with hexagon shapes. And I have an AccuQuilt die, and I said, okay, this all aligns. Like I'm gonna start. I want to make flowers, and I thought about that image of the sisters in the field, right? And they had those purple flowers in the field,
Yes.
and so I got the book. I was like, I want to make a color purple quilt. Like I just have to. And I went to the local fabric store and I saw a jelly roll of purple gradations. I said, okay, like this is aligning, right?
Perfect.
Um, a lot of my quilts, I always start from a photograph. And so that's how I make my pattern. I wanted to use bold fabrics. I love African fabrics. They're my favorite. And so this is what I decided to dress them in bright colors.
Yes.
But making those little hexagon flowers was really exciting. I learned how to make the stems and like use like bias
Yes.
like a bias stem. And so when I'm going, because I'm self-taught, like I'm always like trying to learn a new skill. I was like, ooh, I learned how to make like these bias stems and I can make them have a little shape and wave. And I'm gonna put that in the quilt. And I found this book and I have this die and I'm gonna make these flowers. But the reason why I make it at the end of the day is to celebrate, Black culture, right? I want to
Yes.
always see us in a good light. I always want to have a moment of our treasured memories, right? I always want to put us in a good light. I want to share with the world, the things that we love, right? And so this
Yes.
is just like my tiny little part in the conversation. And I also love about this quote is like I upcycle like those purple kind of shiny fabric. It's
Yes.
like a shirt I had, a sequin shirt I had. I bought it, I think, when I was pregnant, and it was like kind of a maternity shirt. I'm not going to use it again. Let me use that because who wouldn't want any purple sequins on a purple quilt? Like,
Absolutely. It was like that shirt was waiting to become
it
these
was
gorgeous
waiting.
flowers.
It was
Absolutely.
waiting. Yeah, and I love scraps, and so I love to use my scraps. I use the African fabric on the scraps, and so it just kind of like it's a quilt that gives me joy.
Mhm.
I've sold it to a dear friend of mine, so I can visit with it again at another
Oh,
time.
good, good, good. So it's in a place where it will be loved as much as you loved when you made it.
Yes,
So I
absolutely.
love that. That's so the cycle of love is continuing. I wonder
Hmm.
if I could get you to talk a little bit about the AccuQuilt. I have one as well, and I really like the way I can take all different types of fabrics and scraps and turn them into I've got dies for strips and I have dies for half square triangles. And I like the idea of having
Hmm.
the ability to put together something in an unusual fabric, but it can match, other quilting cottons or whatever. Can you talk a bit about how you use AccuQuilt products and how they help you get your own quilting accomplished?
One thing I really like about AccuQuilt is I like the ease of instruction, right? There's so many videos. I'm a visual learner.
Okay.
And so I really love the videos that kind of demonstrate like these are all the possibilities that you can do with it. And because it's an investment piece, you want to know like I'm going to get my money's worth. I'm not just going to buy this to sit on the shelf. And so like as a newer quilter, it's like where you have to cut a lot of fabric, you have to cut a lot of half square triangles, or you want to cut all these things, like to have it be easy to cut. And then for the notches, like when I made like this quilt and I have lots of half square triangles, and the way that those notches are cut up is just easy. It's just easy to line up, and I don't have to worry about if it's going to be on the bias, and if I feed it in the machine correctly, right,
Yes. Yes.
it's going to line up for me, and then all of my projects can look great.
Yes.
And I love the 2.5 inch strip, right? And so that's perfect for binding. Like
Yes.
I just make it and I just keep it nearby, right?
Yes.
And I love how it's just a great scrap buster.
Yes.
I can make letters, and I bought a cube when I first bought it, and so I love that it comes with a cube and it comes with books and instructions. So it can kind of like let me know that I'm not just wasting my money on another product, right?
That's
I
right.
have so many things that I can do with it. But I just love their little videos that shows you how you can do it. Because when I bought mine, it was during the pandemic. And so I've been
Yes.
watching lots of videos all the time, all this consumption. I said, this is going to make me work faster, right?
Yes.
My quilting is going to be a little more accurate if I do
Yes.
everything correctly.
Yes.
Yeah, but it's the accuracy, it's the education, it's the ease. Yeah.
Yes, that I agree. I have an 8-inch cube as well, and I love how it's kind of like that cube gives you, like, dozens upon dozens of projects that you can make, and there's instructions for them. So it's like, even if
Right.
you don't know what to make, if you start cutting up your half square triangles or cutting out your squares or whatever, they'll tell you what you can make. And I do like
Hmm.
those little notches or the little flags they have at the bottom of their half square triangles. So that means that
Hmm.
everything lines up and you don't get those little flags hanging off the end that you do when you cut them the other
Yes.
way. Yeah,
Yes.
it's
Yes. Yes.
really
It's those little dog ears. Yeah. It
the
just
dog
makes
ears.
it so much easier.
Well, let's look at one of the pieces that you did that used that, and then we can talk about some of your other ones. I love this space is the place. Like, Sun Ra is such a important figure in Afrofuturism. Like, I think that
Mhm.
he and Octavia Butler, Samuel Delaney, these artists really help with the fundamental belief that there are Black people in the future and that Black people ourselves are from the future. And so space is the place. Can you talk about this piece and what led to the creation of it and where it is now?
So, a good friend of mine who's a local artist, he's a painter. He put together an Afrofuturism exhibit. And so he's been working on it for 2 years. He kept saying, I want you to make something. And I said, well, I'm not as educated about Afrofuturism. And so he's, sent me some videos and some links to learn about Sun Ra in particular. And the great thing about Sun Ra is that he was from Alabama. He went to school in my hometown at Alabama A&M. And there's a story that when he was here in Huntsville, he was transported to outer space, right?
Yes.
He's transported to outer space. And so that happened here, right? And he came back and he said, space is safer for us than Earth. And it was like, he might be onto something.
Yeah, I think he's got a point.
Got a point. And so I wanted to make something for Afrofuturism. I did use my AccuQuilt to cut out the letters,
Yes.
which is a lot of fun. I used African fabrics for that one. I bought the background fabric on a trip, and it was kind of like space kind of cloud theme. And since I live in the Rocket City, I thought, okay, I'm going to use this for something eventually.
Yes.
And the other crazy thing, which I love about this quilt, is that I was on YouTube and a lady was doing mosaic piecing.
Oh.
And so she kind of demonstrated a technique where she's using, like steam-a-seam and fusible, and she's cutting them into these tiny little pieces. I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut these in tiny little pieces. I'm going to make this gradation, because if you see the original picture from Space of the Place, it's a movie that Sun Ra made.
Yes.
He has this crazy cape, and it's like this ombre yellow and orange cape.
Wow.
So I was like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use this mosaic technique to cut all these little pieces of paper. And when I tell you, it was tedious, but it gave me so much joy. I was so excited to
I'm
do it.
so glad.
And, he has this kind of like Egyptian kind of headdress on.
Yes.
And it's like, when you dig in your stash and you say, ooh, I have some gold fabric. Ooh, I have some shiny fabric. Ooh,
Yes.
something like this. And so, I did that for his headpiece. Someone gifted me some embroidery thread, and I used that to make shoelaces. My daughter was helping me, and she said, he needs shoelaces on his shoes. I said, you know what? He does need shoelaces. And so I sewed some little shoelaces on there. But this piece hung in the exhibit at University of Alabama, Huntsville. Right now, I still have it. It's for sale.
Oh,
But
wow.
it's for sale. But it was just a joy to make. And it helps me. I guess the other thing about the quilts and some of my quilts is that I'm learning something, right? I'm not just putting this man
Yes.
on a quilt. I'm learning something about his life. I'm learning about his contributions to Black America. Like, I'm learning about his contributions to America. And so each piece, like, I'm learning a little bit of something each time, right?
Yes, and speaking of learning and of Alabama, your quilt that I've seen, in quite a few places, the Alabama Writers Quilt. Like this, it says Alabama authors. It's this gorgeous bookshelf type quilt where you have the books arranged by the spines, and the different spines of the books are different fabrics. But you also did a wonderful job of turning some of the author's images facing forward so that we can see who you also have included here as Alabama authors. Can you walk us through this process and let us know about where this quilt is?
So I was in an exhibit here in Huntsville. It was about women as movers, shakers, change makers. And so I was told, you can make a quilt, you can make it as big as you want to. You can do whatever you want to. And it's like, say less, okay?
Exactly.
But I wanted to make a quilt that was Alabama centered. I am a huge audiobook fan. I'm a podcast listener. I always have something in my ears while I'm sewing. And so
Mhm.
I was listening to Ya Jesse's book, Homegoing. She was raised from the age of 10 in my hometown, and her father teaches here locally. And so I said, okay, I have to make a quilt with her in it. And so I wanted to bring in all of these women who were born or raised in Alabama, who were authors. My mother was an English professor. And so I'm just a really big book fan. And this quilt, the reason why I made it is because I want people to be inspired, that you can do something great. These women were from Alabama soil. Even if they didn't stay here for long, their seeds were planted here.
Yes.
And the other thing that's really exciting about this quilt is that it's more than a quilt. There's been, programming attached to it. We've had professors come in and talk about the literary works of the authors.
Yes.
And we've talked about all kind like racism and intersectionality and poetry and, all these themes that are in the book. We can sit there and talk about them, and then we can look at the beautiful quilt too, right?
Yes.
It went on a library tour through our local library system. It went to a local museum. It's going, further south, hopefully to our state capital. But the
Oh,
awesome thing about this quilt is it was purchased by the Historic Huntsville Foundation. They own the quilt, and so
wow.
they have taken the quilt further than I could have imagined, right? And they've taken it, and we've invited the public to come in and have conversations about these women. It's like, once again, we can continue to tell their stories, right? And the
Yes.
ones that have passed, we can continue to honor them.
Yes.
Like Harper Lee, for example, we had a book chat and we talked about To Kill a Mockingbird and to really break it down. And some of those things that she talked about are still relevant now, right?
Indeed. Indeed.
To when I made it, I really just kind of like watched a few YouTube videos and said, how do I make a bookshelf quilt? And so I was like, oh, this is how you make it. And this is the funny part. Someone told me there was a local quilt shop going out of business. And I
Oh,
said, oh, I need some fabric for this quilt. And the people are like, oh, let's get together and go. And I said, I ain't going with y'all. I got up early in the morning and I drove like an hour away and bought up, like, I think I got 20 bolts of fabric for like $120.
oh my
And
gosh.
so a lot of the fabric is from local quilt shops that I
Oh, that's so
use.
good.
Um, I try to each block has like a theme, like Margaret Walker at the top. She has like African fabric behind her.
Yes.
Sonia Sanchez, her hair, are a pair of my grandfather's pants, his
Oh,
gray pants.
oh, I love it.
Harper Lee I told that she loved to tend her flower boxes. And so she has on a floral top and a very like feminine
Yes.
theme.
Yes.
Ya Jessie is like on a bright colored background. It's some outdoor fabric that I found at Joann, and it just felt like
Oh,
youthful
yes.
for her. Zora Neale Hurston, if you see that iconic photo of her where she has that hat
The hat.
on and
Yes.
then that chevron background behind
Yes.
it,
Yes.
and I found some chevron, fabric in my stash, I said, ooh, like, okay, I'm going to use this for
Yes.
her.
Yes.
Um, Fanny Flagg at the bottom, she wrote the book Fried Green Tomatoes. And
Tomatoes. Yes.
so
Yes.
her background are little like green and brown circles. So they
Oh,
kind of look
yeah.
like,
Like a
like
fried tomato.
like a
Oh,
fried tomato. And then the other thing is again, for my Aki quilt, I use the 2-inch square. Well, I use a large 2-inch die, and then you can, put the fabric on and subcut it to
yes.
make the letters. So all those letters at the top and the bottom are just like 2-inch, those little 2-inch
Square
squares.
piece. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. It's really
Yeah.
very beautiful. And especially when you talk about the Hurston image, that's one of the iconic images of Hurston from the Harlem Renaissance. And so once again, your photography and quilting kind of come together because you're able to look at that image and say, I want to reproduce it in the quilt. And so it's just really cool to see how you were able to kind of to do that and to bring that together. I wanted to talk about this one as well. You've got this gorgeous Jesse Owens quilt, and I love the way that it has such powerful movement that we get to see Owens, moving through space in this piece through the Olympic rings. Can you talk
Yeah.
a bit about how you're quilting in this context, in addition to the applique, helps to fuel this momentum that we see
Right.
in this piece?
Well, first, Jesse Owens is from Lawrence County, Alabama, which is about 30 minutes from where I'm from. So I said, okay, he's a homeboy, right? I have to honor this black man, who's from, not far from where I'm from. And I always want it to be like a sense of inspiration. If he can do this, then,
Yes.
we can do this. We can do excellent things. This quilt was really hard to make. I think I bit off more than I could chew when I started it. It's about 65 inches wide, and
Whoa.
and it's And it's only because I had a big piece of fabric that I don't know where I was like, oh, this seems like a good background. Let's start off with this big white piece of fabric. But I used a lot of different fabrics, like the black circle for the Olympic rings was from some upholstery fabric that I had. I upholstered like a bench in my bedroom, and I took, took that leather off, and I said, well, what am I going to do with it? I can't throw it away. I'm going to have to repurpose it. And so I used that. And the applique technique was difficult because he is in motion, and he was kind of like, I couldn't get it quite stiff enough. He's kind of floppy. So it just took a lot of seam and, fusing to go on to get it to lie just correctly.
Right.
The circles were really hard because when I make my patterns, I start from the photograph. And so I'm winging it all the time. So it's like when I print it out and I cut out that circle, it's not perfect, right? And then when I go from paper to fabric, I have to find a way to give it strength, to stiffen it, to have it so it's not so loosey-goosey. And then when I made the binding, I love scraps. And so I said, well, I'm just going to make a scrappy binding. And I started with my AccuQuilt, with my die, my 2-inch die. And I just took all of my scraps and I said, I'm going to, mimic the colors in the quilt.
Yes.
The quilting, and I'm thankful for my long arm for the quilting portion because, it's just basically a bunch of like cursive L's, right, going across. And then I flip them to go the other way around and then, go across again and flip them to go underneath. And so it's a lot of dense quilting. I try to do that to kind of help him pop up a little bit off the quilt.
Yes.
So to give it a little more dimension. It was a joy to make. It was really hard to make. I'm so proud of it. I had it in a local little quilt exhibit at a local library near me, and it won 3rd place. So I'm very proud.
Listen, I don't know who won 2nd and 1st because this is really very stunning, and the way that it just feels like there's a lot of life in this quilt.
Mm-hmm. He's like in motion, like he is heading towards something, right? He's heading toward that finish line. And I'm heading towards something. I don't know, as with this gospel song, what the end will be, right?
That's right.
But we're heading towards something. We're starting off low, but we're lifting ourselves and we're going forward. So that's what I hope the quilt kind of, emulates.
It really does. And I just am so grateful for your time today and for walking us through these amazing pieces. And I'm going to now ask you the question that we ask everybody on the Stitch Please podcast. Right? You ready? The slogan of the Stitch Please podcast is that we will help you get your stitch together. Tiavalya Befecadu, photographer, quilt maker, artist. What advice do you have for our listeners to help us get our stitch together?
Lisa, I've thought about this a lot because I'm a fan of the podcast. And I would always say to listen to your own voice, to be confident in your decision when it comes to your artwork, when it comes to your quilting, and to just, follow your own desires. Don't worry about the opinions of others, because when you make something and you're pleased with it, that's enough. I could make a million quilts that never sold, but if I like them, then I have done myself justice. So I would just say, listen to your own voice and be guided by, what's in your heart.
Wow. And on that note, I thank you so much for being with us today on the Stitch Please podcast. Let us know how we can find you on the socials, because people are going to be looking for you. How can we find you on the socials?
On Instagram, it's at Tiavalya. It's Tiavalya. And I'm on Facebook. It's Tiavalya Photography and Textile Art.
Thank you so much for being with us today. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support, and come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.